Got a 1996 Volvo 850 turbo here. It's making an awful noise from the right front tire. I don't know if you can hear it on camera, but it gets worse with speed. And it sounds a lot like a wheel bearing to me. Let's get the car into the garage and check it out. The first step you need to do when replacing the wheel bearings or anything with the CV axle shaft is you need to remove the center cap here on the wheel. I usually use some sort of plastic pry tool, but with a pry tool you can, I've already done this, pull the center cap off. And if you don't have power tools, I guess this is the important first step. If you have power tools, no big deal, but you'll want to put an axle nut socket. In this case, I've got a 36 millimeter socket. Have somebody stepping on the parking brake or stepping on the brake pedal and have the parking brake set, and you can get a breaker bar on here to break that free. So that's your first step if you don't have power tools. Once you have broken the axle nut free, you can go ahead and break the lug nuts loose and jack and support the vehicle on jack stands. The next step after that is to loosen the bolts holding the lower ball joint on. The bolt on this side, the bolt head is a 13 millimeter. The other side here, right there, and this side is a 15. So we'll have to loosen that and remove the bolt, and from there we can lower the control arm. As you can see here, I got the bolt loosened. So now we're going to use a pry bar and try to get the lower control arm out of the knuckle assembly. Just like that, the lower control arm is released from the knuckle assembly, and from here we can pull the CV shaft assembly out of the steering knuckle or the wheel bearing. Okay. All right. So from here we can access the bolts for the wheel bearing, but I'll have to readjust the camera here to get you a better view. Okay, now we'll want to get the brake caliper out of the way. So I'll just remove these two bolts right here. They are 15 millimeters. That'll allow the whole bracket to come off. From there, we'll hang the brake caliper someplace suitable and remove the brake rotor, and that'll give us access to the wheel bearing or the wheel hub assembly. Okay, we can now remove the rotor. To do that, once the caliper is off, we'll need to remove this locating pin for the wheel. And this one's held in with a 10 millimeter. So that comes off, and the rotor should just come right off at this point, like so. I don't know if you'll be able to hear this, but if you spin this old wheel bearing by hand, it's definitely shot. Should not be that noisy. It is, however, pretty tight. There's no real play there, but it is making a bunch of noise, and there's the telltale dust all around where the bearing seal probably failed. This vehicle's got 205,000 miles, so it's about due. Okay, hopefully we got a good view of the back side of the steering knuckle. Anyway, these are the 4 bolts that hold the wheel bearing or wheel hub assembly onto the knuckle. As you see here, these have the external torque style bolt head. These are an E14. So you'll need to buy yourself a socket, E14, to get these off. And as you can see, I reattached the lower ball joint just temporarily so that things weren't flopping around when I try to loosen these bolts. All right, as you can see here, they're quite tight. Try not to hurt yourself. But anyway, here's a little bit of a view of what the socket looks like. It's just a inverse Torx. Tools readily available. This is, I think, one of the only locations on this particular style of Volvo where you'll find these external Torx type heads. But as you can see here, I'm just loosening the 4 bolts. And once those bolts are out, the wheel hub assembly will pop right out. Okay, as you can see here, I've got 3 of the 4 bolts out. And this is a California car, so things just pop right off. If you're in the Rust Belt, you might have to strike this with strike this flange towards the outside of the vehicle to loosen this. But for the most part, most of these ones that I've done have fallen right out. Okay, here's the wheel bearing assembly that I elected to use for this job. This is a German company, unfortunate name for those of us that speak English. But this is the OE manufacturer of these wheel bearings, German made. And as you can see here, just put a light layer of anti-seize onto the mating surfaces here. So in the future, if we're ever having to come back to this vehicle, and if this vehicle ever moves to the salt belt, this will come right off. So basically backwards of how we took it off, we're just gonna put it back in here and put the 4 bolts in. Okay, I got the 4 bolts on. The torque spec for all 4 of those bolts is 48 foot-pounds. And then once you hit 48 foot-pounds, you have to torque the bolt an additional 60 degrees past that torque spec. I believe these are a torque to yield type bolt, and it's always advisable to put brand new bolts in. Anyway, the metric equivalent to 48 foot-pounds is 65 Newton meters. So 65 Newton meters and an additional 60 degrees of movement or turning, and that's the spec for those 4 bolts. Okay, from here everything is pretty much reverse of how we removed it. So we'll go ahead and fit the CV axle back into the wheel hub. We'll put the lower ball joint back into the knuckle, straighten the wheel out, and put the brake disc back on. And from there, tighten the bolt for the brake disc, and then put the brake caliper back on, put the wheels back on, and final torque on the spindle here. Okay, so let's go ahead and get this going. Sometimes the lower ball joint can be kind of a pain, but just try to get everything lined up, and eventually it'll shake into place just like that. All right, so the lower ball joint's in place. We just got to put the bolt in, tighten it to spec. I'll go ahead and look that spec up now and get back to you. The torque spec for the lower ball joint pinch bolt is 37 foot-pounds. So I'll go ahead and torque that right now. All right, 3 times for good measure. So that bolt's on tight. Oh, if I can get my tools out. All right, that's out. Next order of business, put the brake disc back on. The brake disc retaining bolt, and the brake caliper. Okay, I've got the brake rotor back on. The guide pin, or whatever you want to call this, that holds the brake disc back on is torqued to 22 foot-pounds. Now we're offering the caliper back onto the rotor here, like so. And these 2 bolts here, these 15 mils, are torqued to 77 foot-pounds. So go ahead and get those torqued down. We'll put the wheel back on and we'll do final torque on the axle shaft stub here. Okay, wheel lug nut torque is 88 foot-pounds. The center nut here is at 89 foot-pounds plus an additional 60 degrees. Okay, additional 60 degrees. Oh, I need to get a breaker bar for this. But basically we're gonna go from about here to about right there for 60 degrees. If you have an angle gauge to make it more precise, that's even better. Unfortunately, the camera died just as I got my breaker bar and angle gauge out. So I torqued the bolt an additional 60 degrees. And from there, we took the vehicle for a test drive and the noise complaint was resolved. So anyway, hope you found this video helpful. If you haven't already, please subscribe and have a great day.